Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to your newest lesson from the group over here at fullskillsexamprep.com. So this lesson is on the startup visa. This is, of course, a really great topic to study for your full skills exam because it's pretty concise. And by going through this lesson series, combined with reading the links on the website, you are going to be one step closer to passing the ICCRC Full Skills Exam. So a big thank you for tuning in. This lesson will take you probably about 2 hours to go through, including all of the reading. Now, if you're going through this lesson on our website, fullskillsexamprep.com, you'll see all of the links are here for you. So you just have to click on these and read through them. By reading through these, of course, it's going to give you a better understanding of this topic as a whole. So even though there haven't really been any instances of the startup visa in judicial reviews or court decisions or anything like that, this topic has been in the news a little bit. So you can take a look at these articles over here, and again, it's going to give you a better understanding of this topic as a whole. Now, these are the really important ones to take a look at in terms of preparing for your full skills exam. Again, all of these links are just below, so you'll have to work your way through these. The most important one is over here, is the CIC website, or the IRCC website. Now, this one is, of course, always the most up-to-date information, so that's a really great place to look to get a full understanding of this topic. You'll, of course, take a look at the manuals as well. So IP13/OP27 is about the startup visa business class. And those manuals are always really interesting to read and great to read because they reference the articles as well. But this one is slightly out of date. So if you want to read IP13, it's the same thing as OP27, of course. It's really great to read to help you answer a few questions, but remember that it is slightly out of date. So the best place to study is, of course, on the CIC website. As you work your way down this list as well, you can see in November 22nd, 2014, when the government announced this new program. So it's good, again, just to give you a broader view of this topic, and of course the Gazette when they announced this program as well. Now, when we are analyzing this in terms of preparing for the ICCRC Full Skills Exam, it's really important to take a look at the steps involved in a person's application under this program. Just as any other program, each step has to be successful in order for the person to progress to the next steps. For step 1, we have the fact that the person has to pitch his or her business idea to a designated organization. This is an interesting step because it relies quite a bit on the applicant himself or herself. So they have to go and basically sell their idea and try to convince a designated organization to support their business idea. If they are successful, they will move on to the next step, which is being accepted for support by this organization. We are going to look pretty deeply into these topics as well to see what exactly is meant by support. If the person or group of people are supported by a designated organization, then they will receive a certificate and a letter of support. And this is, of course, essential for the application. And just because a person or group of people is or are supported by a designated organization, that doesn't mean that they are automatically accepted for permanent residency, because they have to still meet the business criteria set forth by the IRCC, and of course the individual criteria as well. Finally, if they meet all of this, they would apply for permanent residency and, of course, hopefully be accepted. Let's dig deeply into this first step, which is pitching the idea to a designated organization. Now, in order to completely understand this first step required under the startup visa, we will answer 4 main questions. So first of all, what is a venture capital fund? What is an angel investor? And also, what is a business incubator? Of course, the overlying question that we need to answer is what exactly is meant by a designated organization? When we are taking a look at that first word of organization, we have 3 options. So the first option there is a venture capital fund. The next option is an angel investor. And the third one is a business incubator. We're going to take a look at each of these thoroughly as well to give you a better understanding of the requirements under the startup visa program in order to, again, better help you if you encounter this type of question in your exam. So first of all, what is a venture capital fund? Now, the definition is that venture capital funds are investment funds that manage money from investors seeking private equity stakes in startup and small and medium-sized enterprises with strong growth potential. And these investments are generally characterized as high-risk, high-reward opportunities. So when a person is applying under this program, remember that first step is that they have to pitch their business idea to a designated organization. One of those types of organizations can be venture capital funds. And just as the definition says, those types of funds want to invest, they'll give some money to a person or group starting a business with the hope that the business will be successful and pay off for the venture capital fund. If you've ever seen the TV show Dragon's Den or Shark Tank, those are the people who work for those are pretty similar to venture capital funds. Now, the big difference for us, of course, in preparing for the full skills exam is to completely understand what is meant by a designated venture capital fund. So it's not enough just to have somebody support a business. If that person or the group or corporation or whatever isn't designated by the IRCC, then that will not meet the requirements for immigration. So currently the IRCC designates all of these groups as being designated as venture capital organizations who can support people who are applying for permanent residency under the startup visa program. And remember, of course, in that first step, the applicant or the future Canadian, you might call him, or her, would get in touch with one of these groups or all of these groups and try to sell their idea to these. And if one or more, as we'll see later on, of these groups decides to support this person's business idea, then they can proceed to the next steps. The other option for potential immigrants under this stream is getting support from an angel investor group. Now, an angel investor is similar to what we saw previously. The definition given here is a small but increasing number of angel investors invest online through equity crowdfunding or organize themselves into angel groups or angel networks to share research and pool their investment capital, as well as to provide advice to their portfolio companies. So again, if you've ever seen the TV show Dragon's Den or Shark Tank, those often have angel investors as the judges, or some of those people investing sometimes own or work for venture capital firms as well. And basically, they want to, again, give money and hope for a return on their investment. Now, when we look at designated angel investor groups, these are the options that are currently available. So you can see that, interestingly, almost all of these have angel in the name, and the applicant would try to get one of these companies or several of these companies to support his or her business idea. And if a person gets support from a group that's not designated, again, this would mean that he or she is not eligible under the Startup Visa program. Finally, the last option is to get support from a business incubator. So for all of you, as you are going to start your immigration businesses soon, it's a good idea to take a look at business incubators in your city, because often they support small business people like yourselves, and they provide quite a bit of support for you. So even though we're studying this in terms of the Startup Visa program, remember that these programs are there for you as well. So it's really great to do some research on this topic to see if you qualify for a business incubator program. Now, business incubation programs are often sponsored by private companies or municipal entities and public institutions, such as colleges and universities. Their goal is to help create and grow young businesses by providing them with necessary support and financial and technical services. So you can see the difference between this one and the previous two is that there is no real financial requirement in here. However, it's important to remember that these are extremely competitive for clients. And again, it's one thing to get support from a business incubator. It's quite another to get support from a designated business incubator. These are the groups that are currently eligible to help people apply under the Startup Visa program. So remember, it can't just be someone's friend or uncle or something like that who gives support. It has to be a designated group. So that covers the first step involved in understanding the Startup Visa program. So we have a pretty thorough understanding that a person needs to pitch his or her business idea to not just an organization, but a designated organization. Remember that with those organizations, you have three options. You have venture capital firms, you have angel investors, and finally, you have business incubators. And of course, remember that if a person's getting support from one of those groups, the group has to be designated by the IRCC. Let's move on to the second step, and that is, of course, getting accepted for support by these organizations. Now, in order to understand exactly what is meant by support in this second step, we'll take a look at three main questions here. So first of all, what is meant by the amount of support that is required by the IRCC. For some people applying under this program, there might be multiple supporters, so that might come up in your ICCRC Full Skills Exam. Of course, we'll take a look at how to handle those types of questions. And finally, what is exactly reviewed by the IRCC? So remember, you have two big elements in here. One is a person getting accepted for support by one of these designated organizations, and another is, of course, to take a look at what the IRCC officers are looking for. So let's take a look at what exactly is meant by support from these organizations. Now, the minimum amount of support required from a person who gets support from a venture capital fund is $200,000. Under an angel investor, if a person is accepted for support by an angel investor or an angel investor group, the minimum amount of money required from the angel investors to the person's business idea is $75,000. Now, for a business incubator, there is no specific dollar amount in here. What business incubators usually do is they will give the person support and training and that type of thing. So a person has to get accepted into that program. Now, a potential question that could come up on your exam is, what if a person has a really, really great business idea and gets support from multiple sources? So let's just take a look at this in case it pops up in your exam. Now, if a person gets support from 2 or more venture capital funds, one organization has to take the lead on this. And that organization would issue the certificate and letter. But of course, the minimum amount of money from both of these is $200,000 in total. So it could be $125,000 from one venture capital fund and $75,000 from the other, but the total would have to be $200,000. If a person gets support from 2 angel investor groups, then you can see that it is similar. So the minimum amount would have to be $75,000. Now that could be $50,000 from one group and $25,000 from another group, but the total minimum would have to be $75,000. If there is ever an instance of a scenario in your exam where a person gets support from both a venture capital fund and an investor, an angel investor, then the minimum would be the largest minimum. So in this case, it would be $200,000. So the angel investor group can give $75,000 and the venture capital fund can give $125,000 or more, of course. But the minimum required would be $200,000 in this case. Now, it's important to remember that it is not enough just to get that support from one of those groups. When the CIC or IRCC officer takes a look at the application, he can request a peer review. So the officer can ask for this in any case having to do with the startup visa program. And the peer review would take a look very deeply at whether or not the group supporting this person's business idea has performed their due diligence. Now, companies who are investing $200,000, $75,000 into a person's business idea would obviously take this very, very seriously and do a really thorough job in looking at a person's business idea and the ability, of course, of the person to do this business. But the IRCC officer definitely has that power to ask for peer review. Now, that peer review would analyze whether or not the company will be incorporated in Canada or has been already, if the person meets, or the people in the application meet the business ownership requirements, if the business itself is viable in being a successful business, and of course the area of business. Is this a high growth business area? If it's a person opening a store, for example, or something like that, that's not really what this program is made for. And of course, if a person has been accepted into an incubator program. So again, the officer can request a peer review, and that peer review would focus on whether or not the group supporting the person has performed due diligence in making sure that this person can do the job. Now that concludes our second step, which is the support needed by an organization. Let's take a look at the third step. This is more a procedural step over here, and as with regard to the certificate and letter of support that will be issued. In order to understand this, there's only two little questions that we will answer, and that is, how do these organizations prove the support that they're going to give to this person, and where do letters and certificates get sent to? So you can see over here that these investor organizations have to be designated, just like we talked about before. Remember that when we are looking at the amount of financial support that a venture capital fund must give, it is $200,000. Now, if a person is accepted in this program, that venture capital fund will issue a letter of support to the candidate and a commitment certificate to the CIC. Angel investors do the exact same thing, as do business incubators. So every single group will give a letter of support to the candidate and also send a commitment certificate directly to the CIC. Remember, as we discussed before, if multiple groups are supporting this person, one of these groups would have to take the lead and send that letter of support to the candidate and the commitment certificate to the CIC. So that concludes the third step. What we have to take a look at now is the fourth step in this stream. And that is, of course, meeting the business criteria and the individual criteria. Now, in order to answer this, we will take a look at four big questions. And these, of course, the reason we're looking at this in terms of questions and answers is because that is exactly what you have to do for your ICCRC Full Skills Exam, to get used to questions and answers, questions and answers. This is going to help you to pass the exam, of course, because if you ever have a question having to do with a topic in here, you'll know exactly how to answer it. So the questions we'll look at now are, what are the requirements for the individuals under this program? Are there certain ownership requirements involved? When a entrepreneur or a person going under this program is bringing staff, what are the requirements for that? And what happens if a person is rejected? Now let's take a look at the general requirements required for individuals going under this stream. So first of all, there is a cap in this program. Now, if any program in immigration reaches the cap in real life, you still have to study that program for your exam. In this case, the cap is 2,750 applications per year. As we discussed before, they have to receive support from a Canadian business entity, and that, of course, means a designated Canadian business entity. Just like most of the other federal programs, the person can't intend to reside in Quebec. If a person intends to reside in Quebec, if he's a good candidate for the startup visa program, but wants to reside in Quebec, there's still an entrepreneur program in Quebec as well as an investor program. There used to be an education requirement in this, and that was 1 year of post-secondary education. That has been canceled. So if you ever see that when you're looking at the website or the manuals, this was canceled. Language requirements. So the person needs a minimum of CLB 5. Proof of funds, of course. And an important one that we'll take a look at pretty deeply are the people in the business proposal. So there are 5 essential people that can be identified to come to Canada as permanent residents under this program, and we'll take a look at that thoroughly.
All right, so as we saw, the minimum language score is a CLB 5 needed for this. Now, you might make an argument that you might say, well, if someone's starting a business as a programmer or something like that, where they don't really need to speak that much English or French, why would they need this requirement? Well, and I mean, the easy answer is just because the government said so. So that's what we're looking for, is a CLB 5. And if you ever have a scenario in the exam where they say, well, this person's a genius, we have, of course, a question similar to this in the simulations, where it's basically a person's a genius but doesn't speak English or French. Would he qualify under this program? And the answer would be no, because the language requirements are the language requirements. They're not suggestions. So a CLB 5, as we've seen in previous lessons, is a 5 in everything with IELTS, except for reading it's a 4. CELPIP's a 5 in everything. TEF is a 226 to 270 in writing and speaking, a 181 to 216 in listening, and a 151 to 180 in reading. For le TCF, it's a 6 in writing and speaking, and then listening is a 369 to 397, and reading is a 375 to 405.
Now with this stream, it's really important to be able to understand who can come with the company. So essential staff can immigrate to Canada under this program under the same business idea. Now there's a maximum amount of people who can immigrate under one business proposal or idea that is being supported from one of those designated organizations, and that is 5. So 5 is the maximum in this stream under one business idea, of course. Now these people have to be identified in the letter and the certificate that goes to the IRCC. And with these people, of course, it's the designated organization that has to recognize these people as being essential to the company. With that peer review that we saw as well, that is another element that will be looked at with the peer review, is if this person is actually essential or not. All of these people have to meet the same requirements because they are essentially immigrating under the startup visa themselves. And that, of course, means in terms of language, proof of funds, intent and ability, etc. There is a minimum ownership amount as well for these co-owners. So they have to own at least 10% of the voting rights within a company. If the designated organization is taking a piece of the company, then together the co-owners and that designated organization must own more than 50% of the voting rights. These voting rights have to be tied to shares within the company. So it can't just be somebody who is the president of a company with a certain salary but doesn't own any shares in the company making decisions. The voting rights have to be tied in with the shares of the company. And this is a big one. So if one of those people who are nominated as essential staff is rejected from the CIC/IRCC officer, that means everybody is rejected. So you can see that there's two really big steps in being certain about how essential a staff person is. The first sort of guard is through the designated organization, and the second one is through the IRCC. So let's take a look at this in terms of everything we've been looking at. So we saw already that the first step involved in this is for the person to pitch his or her idea to a designated organization. The person will have to get support from that organization in order to proceed in the next step. There is, of course, the paperwork portion, which is the certificate and letter of support. And we just took a look at the individual criteria that a person has to meet, and also the business, in order to, again, be a good candidate under this stream. Finally, the last step is applying for permanent residence. So we'll just take a look at that one quickly, and this will be our final step in understanding this topic. In order to understand this, we'll take a look at three big questions. That is, of course, what happens when a person applies for PR under the Startup Visa program? Are there any ongoing requirements? And finally, is substituted evaluation used in this program? Now, in this final step, a person has to apply for permanent residence. Now, in this, just like every other program, the person has to meet the regular admissibility requirements. That, of course, means that with regard to the person's intent and ability, just like every other program, and of course, not be inadmissible. So if a person is a war criminal or inadmissible because of criminality, health, anything like that, even if a person is supported by a designated organization, of course, they will not be accepted for permanent residence. Remember that in a lot of the economic streams, substituted evaluation can be used by an officer. In this case, it is slightly different. So an officer, of course, can use substituted evaluation, positively or negatively. However, it can't be used to overcome the absence of a commitment from a designated group. And finally, after a person obtains his or her permanent residency, there aren't any ongoing obligations with regard to the business. Of course, they have their residency obligations and the regular type of obligations that a person needs. But when you compare this to some of the other entrepreneur type of immigration streams, for some of those, the person has to check in every year or 2 years or whatever it is to make sure that they have built their business. In this case here, it's a little bit different. There aren't really any obligations in terms of building the business or if the business fails or anything like that in the person keeping his or her permanent residency. So that concludes your lesson on the Startup Visa program. A big thank you for tuning in. It took about half an hour. So thank you for your time in this one here. I hope this has brought you one step closer to passing the full skills exam. If the Startup Visa program was on your to-do list, then continue on. There's the sample questions after this to take a look at. And of course, make sure that you read through those sources that are linked for you on the bottom here in order to, again, give yourself a really complete understanding of this topic. All right, so I'm Kyle Broda, and thank you for tuning in, and I'll talk to you when you take your next video on the sample questions. Have a great day.